So good morning, everyone. My name is Kaleem Saliba. I'm product manager for the information experience area in Pega, which covers data management and integration. And today, myself and Praneeth, who is also the goal owner for the Pega API work, will be walking you through everything you need to know about Pega API. And we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. As such, there's no slides here, or minimal slides, so I'm going to stay mainly in the product. If you have any questions about anything we're covering, please feel free to interrupt us at any time so we can address them. Before I get started, Praneeth, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, this is Praneeth. I'm working out of the Hyderabad office. So I've been with Pega for 4.5 years now, working in the integration area. So myself and Karim are the goal owners for this particular goal, and that's it about me.
Great. Thanks, Praneeth. Okay, so brand new in Pega 7, the first thing I'm going to point out here is if you go to this resources link, there's a brand new option, which although it looks small, actually contains a huge amount of functionality. So if you go ahead and click the Pega API link, this opens an entire documentation page, but it's actually a whole lot more than that. It's an interactive doc that allows you to view everything you need to know about the APIs, to actually test them from here, to debug them, and basically to understand whatever you need to. And what you're looking at right here are a set of resources. These are RESTful resources, and they correspond one for one to the resources one might want to access in Pega via any client, whether it's mobile or some other client. And I'm going to go through them one by one. The first one listed here is assignments. So if I open up the assignments resource, what you see here are the specific APIs, both the endpoints along with the HTTP method required to access those endpoints on the left-hand side, and a description of what the API does on the right-hand side. So we have three for assignments. The first one is get assignments, which is get a list of assignments basically. The second is get assignment details, namely for a particular assignment, and you can tell here because we are also requiring ID as a resource path parameter. This get will retrieve assignment details for one particular assignment. And then post, which will actually go ahead and perform an assignment action, similar to how if you're on an assignment in a flow in the regular end user portal, and you perform an assignment, this will actually have the same effect. Let me expand these now so you can see a little bit more detail. When you expand a particular API, you're given a whole lot of information about what that API will return. In this case, this is the model schema. And you're also given information about the possible HTTP status codes. In this case, it's either 401 unauthorized or 403 requires TLS SSL. Now, what's important to note about all of these APIs before we go too much further here is that they are all secured via basic auth. And that's something to keep in mind. Customers can, in fact, change that because this is configured on the service package. And so that's something to be aware of because customers may likely want to change that. But our recommended best practice here is if you're going to use basic auth, to make sure that these services are secured over TLS, which is the default for this service package. I'll get more into that a little bit later. But what basic auth also means is that you're required to pass in a username and password. And so all of these APIs execute in the context of the user credentials passed in for basic auth. So that means when I call get assignments for a given operator, I'm getting the work list for that operator. That's what that means. And similarly, I'm only able to get an assignment details for a particular assignment ID for an assignment that's actually on the authenticated operator's work list. And in this case, get assignment ID here, you'll notice that since there is a resource path parameter, that parameter is actually listed here. Right? We have an ID parameter, there's a description of that parameter, and you can actually enter a value here and click try it out. And you would see the response. I'll show you how this works with a different API because I don't have an assignment ID handy. Let's just see if someone on the call. Looks like we lost the call.
Oh. Can people?
Can you guys hear me? Is everyone still on the call?
Yes.
Yes, Karim, I can hear you.
I can still hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So that's get assignments ID. So for post assignments ID, this one is a little bit more complex. In this case, the parameters are the assignment ID you want to perform, the action ID, and the content. So let me walk you through these one by one. So the assignment ID, again, is just the particular ID that you want to perform. The action ID is the action on that assignment, right? Because an assignment can have any number of actions. So you need to specify which action you want to perform. And then lastly is content, which is a free-form JSON structure that may or may not need to be passed in, depending on what the action requires in order to be performed. And because we don't currently support returning which fields in a particular assignment are required versus not, this does require knowledge a priori of what the assignment action itself will actually require in order to be performed. So that's something to keep in mind, because you might likely get that question. I get that question quite frequently. How do we know what content is supposed to require? Well, you need to know what the action looks like in PRPC. You actually have to log in, you have to see what it requires, then you have to pass that in here for content.
So the question is, we don't have an option to pass in username and password, right?
The username and password are passed in the header for basic authentication.
Right, but that's fixed, right? Once you configure on the service pack, it's fixed.
No.
No, it's not? Okay.
No, so on the service package, the only thing configured on the service package is basic auth. The username and password are passed in with every single API call.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good, yeah.
So these are all stateless.
Yeah.
It's a good
That's
question.
good, yeah.
And you'll see that there are a couple of additional HTTP status codes here, incorrectly formatted request. And I'm going to have Praneeth actually open up the decision table that shows all the error codes we return. One thing I want to point out here is that we don't show every error you could possibly see in PRPC to a caller of this API, because that could result in potential security issues. So we have a very select list of what we do show, and everything else is caught under a general, I believe, 500 error, where it's just something's wrong, figure it out.
That's right.
Okay, any questions on the assignments resource before I move on?
So the type for the content was a drop-down. What are the other options besides JSON?
JSON is the only option.
Okay.
Yep. We pulled support for XML. There were just too many complications. So this is JSON only.
Hello, I have a question. Let's say I want to attach something or to perform anything on the assignment, and I know to do it with a function. How do I know the action ID which is used? Do I need to run a tracer, and do I need to run fiddler to know?
No. So whenever you get assignments, you'll notice one of the things is the ID of that assignment. Right here.
Yes.
Not that.
So in terms of this, how to sequence these APIs, Praneeth's example using PMF will help demonstrate that. But just to answer your question more immediately right now, the sequence here is I would get the list of assignments for a particular operator, which would return the ID for each one of those assignments. I would then decide to get additional details for that particular assignment with this API, and at that point I have all the information I need to be able to perform an assignment via the post assignments ID API.
Yes, but I'd like to know for the action ID. If I run Fiddler with PRPC, I often see do UI action being called, and after that we are attaching something to work item. I mean, how do I know the action ID as a PRPC developer, or do I get to know if I want to attach something, for example? I created a flow or an activity. how do I get to know the do action ID?
The action ID comes back here. Right, so you can think of the actions as the picture of flow with an assignment, and all the connectors coming off of that flow, and all the local actions on the assignment, and all the case-wide actions. Those are the actions we're talking about here.
So we're talking about flow actions and local actions?
Exactly, yes. We're
Okay,
talking about
thank you.
flow and local actions. Sorry for the confusion, yeah. It's an
Thank you.
important point. And those actions are returned whenever you call get assignment ID. Right, it's a list of actions with the ID, the name, the type, whether it's assignment or otherwise.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
No problem. All right, so let's move on to authenticate. Authenticate is a very simple action. It's basically just returns 401 or 403. There are no other input parameters besides the basic auth header. Right, so the mobile team is using this for their SDK to, for example, to build a login screen on their apps. Right, they want to let someone in. They want to let PRPC manage the authentication, and so they show a screen when they enter the credentials. We simply authenticate with Pega or not if the credentials are incorrect. So this one is pretty straightforward. Before I go into the cases API, I'm going to actually start with a case types API, and this one I'll actually show how this works. So here I'm going to go to try it now, and I'll be returned. You'll see this response body section appeared, listing all the case types I am able to create. In this case, there is just one called visitor, right? And you'll notice if I go over to Designer Studio, that's indeed the only case type I can create, right? Because it's using my credentials here to actually try out the API, and this is the exact JSON response body you would get were you to invoke this API via this request URL. Okay, so the use case here then is once I get a list of case types, I know which ones I have available to be able to instantiate. And so I begin to work with the cases API. The next action here would be to post. I would create a new case. With the content. In this case, the content required is at a minimum case type ID, and I believe that's it actually. So the only real required parameter you need to have in this content body here is the case type ID, and that will use the default starting flow to instantiate your case type. If you have more than one starting flow, you need to include a process ID. And if you want to create a case as a child of another case, you would also specify a value for the optional parent case ID. And if there's anything else that the case required fields in order to actually be able to, for example, get past the new harness from, if we're talking about the UI perspective here, to be able to first create and persist that case, then you have to provide whatever freeform content is required. Again, this is not provided to you because we have no way at the moment to tell you what the case requires beyond case type ID, process ID, parent case ID, and then whatever else you need in order to instantiate that case. And then we have the others here. Get cases simply returns all of the cases that I have created, the authenticated user has created in the default work pool. It's an important distinction here, especially because cases right now are sort of can live in a lot of different places, and getting a list of quote unquote my cases can mean a lot of different things to different people. In this case, it means something very specific. The cases that the authenticated user has created in the default work pool, and that's it. And then the others here are get cases ID. This is to return information for a specific case given its ID. We return all of this information: parent case ID, urgency, created time, last updated by, etc. We return the stages. We return any SLAs. We return child cases, child case types, assignments on that case, and any actions that can be performed. These are case-wide actions, right? Because again, here the resource is case ID. This is not within the context of any particular assignment. And so these actions, you'll note, don't actually have the type value because the type is the same. These are case actions. And this is a good opportunity for me to point out that this data structure you're seeing here is entirely new. We created an abstraction layer for the API, which I'll show once I head over to the Designer Studio. But because our case management classes and properties are so obscure in some cases, and we didn't want to expose them to an end user of this API, we chose to create a whole new abstraction layer so that we could have, friendly properties like these in order to, expose something that makes sense to our customers. So this is all they really ever have to worry about. We handle the translation and normalization internally once requests are made and as the responses are going back out.
Okay, but when we're approximating the actual request, like in the assignments API or in the previous cases API,
Yep.
then we are using our internal property names, right?
No. So your question is when we're returning information for a particular assignment?
No, I'm sorry. When we're passing in arguments.
Yes. So for anything where you have content, right, or it's not a parameter that we identify up front, where it's variable, then yes, anything in content matches one for one whatever PRPC properties need a value in order to create the assignment or create the case.
Even if they have a PY name or a
Yes,
PX name.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So let me just be clear. You will absolutely get PY, PZ, PX, unfriendly looking properties back when you do a get, for example, on a particular case, and those will show up in where is it? Praneeth, does that show up? Yeah, in the content. Right.
Yeah, I would like to point out here that in content, we actually don't show any PX, PY, PZ properties in the response.
Hold on, Praneeth. So content. So if I do a get case ID,
Right.
right, which is doing an obj open on that case, where are all of the contents of that case, the PY properties, all of that stuff.
But it's not so. A case could have, say, custom properties, right? In custom rule sets, not prefixed with the Pega reserved prefixes. So we show up only, we return only those properties which don't begin with PX, PY, PZ.
Right. So non-Pega stuff, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
And those show up in the content.
Right. Yes.
So you can't really get the Pega properties if you need to.
We've mapped the Pega properties to these properties: status, case ID, parent case ID. The one that does come back is PX obj class. PX obj class we return always and must be submitted always, because otherwise we have no way to turn the JSON into the correct clipboard property. And so PX obj class is the one that will come through always. Everything else has been mapped to a friendlier name, as you can see.
Okay. What does insufficient privileges imply? So what sort of changes I need to make to get past that error?
So I'll get into that in a little bit. That involves there's a new Pega API privilege you need to add in order to have access to this. So I'll get into that in a bit. Okay, so the last case one I didn't cover was put cases ID. This allows you to perform an action on a given case ID, again with optional content. Now, ID here is required. Action ID is not required. And what that means is that if I try and update a case without an action ID, it's going to perform the out-of-the-box update case flow action, which really just does an obj open, does whatever changes you want to persist, and then obj saves the case. If you specify an action ID, we'll do whatever that action ID specifies, whatever its purpose is. Now there's another value here, if match. Okay, this is to prevent people from inadvertently overwriting someone else's changes. So what happens here is that whenever you do a get cases, actually no, sorry, it's a get case ID. We return. Praneeth, is there a way to see the headers returned here? The if match header, or sorry, the e
You have to
header?
try. You have to try out one API, Kalim. Because it's a header. It's not what the data model that you're seeing here is just the body,
Right.
the response body.
So we're not showing the header. Let me create a case just so you guys could see.
And by the way, you would get back the e-tag header in response to a create case request as well.
Okay. Right, so Praneeth, to try it out doesn't actually show the headers either. Right? Praneeth, you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Kalim. So can you scroll down a bit? It's below response code. The response headers show up under a different
there we go.
section.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so these are the response headers. One of them is e-tag, which is really the date that the last saved time of the case. And what you need to do when you create a case is pass in the same value. And if the value doesn't match what's on the server at the time you make an update to the case, you will get an error back, because that means someone else has updated the case in the time between you viewing the case and then you making an update. So the next required action at that point is to re-retrieve the case so you get the latest version of it, remake your edits against that version, and then resubmit it with the new required if match header. So I know that's a little complicated. Are there any questions around that?
Yes, sorry, I have a quick question. I see we use cases, so I imagine we use case designer to create these cases. What happens if a customer is upgrading a PRPC application from a PRPC 5 at the time where we were not using a case designer and we just add a work item? Is this working as well with just work items and not case that we create with the case designer?
I believe it is. Praneeth, can you confirm that? I believe that was a recent change we made, right? With the rule utility function we have to support finding the starting flow on older versions.
Yeah, that's a recent change. It's yet to be checked in, but you can, even for older cases, you would still need the class name and the flow name to create a case, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so in the create case API, you can pass, so case type ID is the property where you pass the class name, and the process ID is where you actually give your flow name. So Kalim, if you just expand the post cases API, yeah, if you see the model schema on the right hand side, there's a sample example next to the content, the field.
Yeah.
So case type ID that you see there is where you would specify your class name, the PRPC class name, and process ID will be your starter flow name.
Okay.
So it would work even with a 5.5 version.
All right. Thank you.
I have a quick question about the e-tag.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, it seems that there's a kind of a burden on the programmer to keep track of that e-tag rather than, say, using a HTTP header. Is there a reason that it's not kind of just automatic, like a cookie kind of thing that keeps the session almost in a way? Or
Yeah, so all what's core to these APIs is that they're all stateless, which is
you just
actually,
answered it. That's it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Yeah. So just again, these are RESTful APIs. So they're stateless. They use etag and if match, which is a standard RESTful way to handle this kind of thing.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay. So let me cover the remaining few we have. The data API is all about data pages. Okay, so there are two here. I'll start with the metadata API. This, given a data page name, returns the metadata for that data page. So this is what this looks like. Right, the ID here is the data page identifier. So D_customer, D_account, whatever you have. Right, if you specify it here, let's try it out actually. With a real data page that I have. Nice, okay. So this returns the information about my data page. In this case, I have one parameter, which is visitor ID. So this is, I can use this API to interrogate various data pages. Again, I have to know about the data pages beforehand. We don't have an API to return the list of all data pages in the system. And then once you have the data page you want, and you've learned about what parameters it requires, you would enter that data page here.
Yeah, one thing to note here, Khalim, we cannot try out data pages which take parameters from this UI here.
Correct, yes. So this get data page API, the try it out functionality, only works if the data page doesn't have any parameters. The reason being, the data page parameters are variable, right? You could have none, you could have 15, the names vary. But in order to query the data page with those parameters, you would simply pass them in as query string parameters like this. In fact, we included an example. Right, in this case, we're passing in an ID parameter and a company parameter. And this is exactly how you would do it. And then last, we have the docs API, which returns a JSON version of this entire page. If someone wanted to, do something different with it or display it themselves in some different kind of format. All right, so any questions about any of these at a high level before we dive in to how they're implemented?
Yes, I've got a question. I would like to know why we, Pega System, the company, we decided to provide this Pega API to our customers. Why did we decide to provide all of this? What is the main reason, the main driver behind this?
Sure. A couple of reasons. The first reason is that having sort of an open API has almost become table stakes in being able to compete in the industry. It's become important to analysts as well, and so having this functionality for both analysts and customers is an important story we need to be able to tell, because it allows more than just making Pega appear like an open platform. It allows them to use us however they want to use us without us forcing a particular methodology upon them. So, of course, our strong preference is for people to not run Pega headless. However, we understand that the landscape is quite varied out there and people have their own needs and requirements, and we want to show that we can meet those needs and requirements head on. And,
okay.
That's exactly what we're doing with this API. That, and additionally, the mobile team is building an iOS SDK out of these APIs.
All right.
Right. So this also ties into our mobile story to allow people to build mobile apps natively if they want. Right. If they have their own native apps, they have their own development teams. They're not going away anytime soon, but they also want to work with Pega. They can leverage our APIs in their existing native mobile apps to actually access Pega assets and resources.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And